The lantern caught the carved letters before anything else. Three marks cut into basalt so long ago the edges had softened, the way stone softens when it has held a secret for decades. D.C., 1851. Rowena Calt stood in the back of the cave with her arm raised, the light trembling in her grip, and read those letters the way a person reads something they were not expecting to survive long enough to find. Her fingers went to the stone. Her middle finger settled into the groove of the sea, as though the channel had been cut to that exact width, to that exact depth, for that exact hand. She stood without breathing for a long moment. Ellis was asleep behind her on the wool blanket, his breath even one fist loosely closed near his chin. Outside Nevada territory pressed cold against the cave mouth. She lowered the lantern slowly. 32 years those letters had waited. She had 72 hours of explanation behind her, and the explanation started the way most things in her life had started lately, with a man pushing paper across a desk with two fingers. Aldous Fenn had soft hands. She had noticed them before she noticed anything else about him, before the walnut paneling, before the brass lamp, before the window, that let October light fall across his desk at an angle that made everything on it look more significant than it was. His nails were clean. His ring caught the light. He pushed the deed across the desk the way a man handles something he does not want to touch with his whole hand, and the gesture told her more about what she held than the words printed on it did. Grant Calt sat in the corner with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance. He had not looked at her directly since the reading began. He did not need to. The slight tension at the corner of his mouth communicated everything his silence was performing. Fenn cleared his throat. "Miss Calt." He had started with Mrs. and corrected himself after her single-word correction, and she had watched him do it, the small recalibration, the fractional pause, and cataloged it alongside the two-fingered push and the walnut paneling and the brass lamp. A room told you things if you paid attention to what it was trying to look like. The deed described 19 acres of granite escarpment on the north face of Dry Hollow Valley, a parcel locally designated Calt's Blunder, and one cave structure at the base of the cliff face, referenced in the final clause, with a specificity that suggested her Uncle Silas had considered it important to name it plainly. Fenn used the word unique. She knew that word. In the mouth of a man with clean nails and a walnut desk, unique meant something that had no market value and could not be made to have any. Fenn was too polished to say worthless directly. He had trained himself to reach for the more elegant approximation, the kind that let him sleep without feeling he had said anything cruel. She picked up the deed with both hands. Her grandmother Dorothea had taught her that receive things that matter with both hands, especially the things that don't look like they matter yet. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone does something that wasn't in the script. Grant's chin moved a quarter inch. She turned toward the door without looking at him. 9 blocks home. She counted them because her chest was doing the thing it did when she needed her mind occupied with a task that required no judgment and no grief. Her grandmother had taught her that to count something, child, anything at all. The mind needs a job when the heart is being pressed. 47 steps to the corner of Adams. 12 more to the elm the school children climbed in summer. The rented house came into view past the elm white paint peeling at the porch posts, her kitchen garden still showing the cut stalks of what she'd grown in spring. She would not see that garden in spring again. That was a fact. She received it the way she'd received the deed, without flinching, because flinching from a fact never changed its shape. Vance Ord was on her porch. He stood when she reached the steps, hat in both hands, his fingers working the brim in a slow rotation she recognized as the physical manifestation of a speech he had rehearsed but did not feel good about. He was a decent man in the way that some men are decent when decency costs them little. His son was getting married in November. They would need a place. He was sorry. 18 days. The number dropped into her chest and sank the way stones sink in still water, not crashing, just going down, finding the bottom at their own pace. She thanked him for telling her in person. He nodded twice, the nods of a man deciding whether that was a compliment or an indictment, then walked down the path without putting his hat back on. She sat down on the porch step. Her legs had been deciding to do that for several blocks, and she had overruled them until now. Ellis came out of the house a minute later. He had been watching from the window. She understood, though he would not say so. He sat beside her without asking what had happened. From his pocket he produced a stone, small and gray oval, in the way creek stones become oval, which is through patience applied over a long time. He placed it in her palm without ceremony. 6-year-olds gave gifts with total seriousness and no performance. She closed her hand around it. "Where do we go, Mama?" His voice was quiet, the question practical rather than afraid. She looked at her boy, her mother's mouth, his father's eyes, something else entirely his own, a watchfulness she had never found the right name for. "I don't know yet, baby." He nodded with the particular trust of a child who has decided that if his mother does not know yet, she will know by tomorrow. That trust was going to break her if she let it reach her fully. She did not let it. That night she sat at the kitchen table with one candle, in the deed in the cedar box that was the only thing in the house she could say was truly hers. Had been hers since before the marriage at 20, before Webb, before everything that came with Webb, and then came after Webb. The box was cedar, and the smell of it was the smell of her grandmother's hands. Inside a leather notebook, the cover cracked at the spine, the pages thinned at the edges to the color of a creek bed in late summer. Dorothea Coutts' handwriting moved across those pages the way water finds its way through gravel, not fighting the material following what opened. There was also a folded paper creased on the same 4 lines for many years. She unfolded it. A hand-drawn sketch ink gone brown at the edges, a cross-section of a cave mouth dimensions noted in small cramped figures, annotations indicating the direction of prevailing wind, a dotted line marking the path of smoke from a fire built at a specific angle. Dated October 1851. At the bottom of the sketch in her grandmother's smaller hand, found on the north face base of the escarpment dry hollow, the fissure in the ceiling draws, "Could winter here." Rowena set the sketch beside the deed. The cave on the deed was the cave on the sketch. She opened the notebook. She had read it many times since Dorothea died when Rowena was 14, read it as a girl, as a young wife, as a widow with a child on her hip, as a woman that the town of Crestfall had collectively decided to look past. The first entry was dated October 1851. She had always wondered about that year. Dorothea had married Jasper Coutt in 1843. She had a daughter in 1845, Rowena's mother. So in 1851, Dorothea had a 6-year-old child and a husband. Yet the entries read like a woman alone. The notebook had never quite said why, until Rowena turned to a page she had read before, and this time read differently because this time she had a deed to a cave on her kitchen table. The entry said, "Valley floor north face above me. Wind curls here, doesn't fall straight. Cave at the base, low entrance, opens up inside. Fissure in the ceiling draws the smoke out clean. Spent 4 nights. He won't find me here." He. Rowena read it again. Then again. Her grandfather Jasper Coutt, the man she had known as a heavy silence at the head of the table, who had once thrown a cast-iron pot across the kitchen because the coffee had cooled Jasper, who had died of fever in 1859 and been buried with a marker paid for by the county because the family hadn't the cash that winter. Her grandmother, who Rowena remembered as a woman of unusual stillness and dry humor, who could read weather 3 days out by looking at the color of the sky, who pressed dried flowers into her letters and taught Rowena to count. When her chest was tight, that woman had run in 1851 with a 6-year-old daughter, and she had hidden in a cave, and she had stayed until it was safe to come back, and she had never said so to anyone that Rowena knew of. She had only written it down. She had only kept the notebook. She had only left the sketch in the cave and the coordinates for a granddaughter she would not live to see grown, as though she had understood across all those quiet years that the knowledge would be needed again. Stone holds what men cannot read. The first line of the first entry. Rowena put both palms flat on the open notebook. Her shoulders moved once, twice involuntarily before she brought them still. She did not cry. She breathed. Then she stood up and went to the closet under the stairs. She had grown up on her father's ranch outside Elko, hauling fence posts and stacking hay from the time she was old enough to be useful. Her arms knew sustained work. Her back knew what it meant to press against resistance for hours without yielding. She thought of that now as she pulled her tools from the closet, the hatchet, the coil of rope, the canvas pack, and understood that whatever the cave asked of her body had a memory for that kind of asking. Ellis found her before dawn. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, hair pushed sideways on the left, bare feet on the cold floor, and looked at the kitchen. The empty shelves, the jars ranked on the table by size, the cast-iron pot wrapped in cloth. her blanket folded into a tight square, with the particular calm of a child who has learned to read the difference between disaster and decision. Are we leaving, Wayne? Yes. Where? She knelt down. She put her hands on his small shoulders. She told him they were going to a place his great-grandmother had once stayed a long time before Rowena was born. He thought about this with visible seriousness. He wanted to know how far. 2 days walking. He wanted to know if it would be cold. Yes. If they would have a fire. Yes. He nodded. Then he asked the only question that mattered, will you be there? She pulled him in close, her face in his hair, the fast, small knock of his heartbeat against her collarbone. Yes, baby, I will be there. He pulled back, looked at the kitchen, asked what he could do. She told him to pack his things, whatever he wanted to bring, only what fit in the cart. He turned and went to his room with the seriousness of a soldier given an order. She would find out later that his bundle contained 7 gray creek stones, a piece of birch bark with an owl drawn on it in charcoal, 2 shirts, and the small wooden horse his father had carved in the one good year before the drinking made him a different man. She needed a cart. That meant Orrin Mackey. He lived 4 blocks east in a house that leaned slightly south, and he was at his kitchen table when she knocked. He rose too fast and knocked his chair backward. She pretended not to see it. She told him what she needed without explaining why a cart. 2 days she'd return it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man making a calculation that involves more than what was spoken. Then he said he'd bring it by that evening, and he'd include a sack of flour, and she wasn't to argue about the flour. She did not argue. At his door she stopped. Don't tell anyone. He said he wasn't going to. She believed him. They left on a Tuesday morning. The frost hadn't lifted from the grass. The cart had 2 wooden wheels that found every rut in the hardpack, and it was heavier than it looked. Ellis walked beside her with his bundle under his arm, his boots striking the road with a steadiness she recognized as something he had made a decision about, a posture chosen, not inherited. The town watched them leave. She felt the eyes in the way she had felt them for 2 years, since the day Webb's drinking made the choice for her, sidelong, careful, the kind of watching that performs its own disinterest. She kept her chin level. She kept her eyes on the escarpment rising at the far end of the valley, gray, massive, indifferent to the opinions of Crestfall, Nevada, and that indifference was beginning to seem to her like a quality worth moving toward. She was half a block from the edge of town when the voice came. Cyril Strand was standing before the doors of First Methodist, hands behind his back coat, buttoned against the October wind, his posture the posture of a man who has arranged himself to be looked at from a distance. She stopped the cart. She did not go to him. He came to her, measuring the distance between them with the calculation of a man who wanted to be seen speaking to her without being seen embracing her situation. He had prayed about her, he said. He wanted her to know there was still time, to repent, to return, to bring her boy into a Christian home. She looked at his face, the face that had looked directly at her from the pulpit 3 months after the divorce proceedings, the face that had constructed a sermon around women who break their vows and delivered it to a congregation that already knew who it was for. She felt the heat of 2 years rise in her chest, everything accumulated since the day she had stood up from the third pew and walked out and not returned. She let none of it into her voice. She thought of her grandmother, who had also been told to return by men built like this. Men with clean consciences and well-rehearsed authority, and she spoke the way she imagined Dorothea would have spoken. Quiet, finished, not asking for anything in return. Reverend Strand, she held his eyes. My husband drank. He raised his hand to my child. The Lord saw it. I am at peace with the Lord. A pause, brief and deliberate. I am not at peace with you. His mouth opened, a slow, preparatory movement. She picked up the cart handle before whatever was coming could arrive. Good day. Ellis fell into step beside her without being asked. One of the women on the dry goods porch started a sentence. She heard it begin, heard the intake of breath that preceded it, and then silence, which meant something in her bearing had been enough. She did not look back. She had made the decision the moment her fingers closed on that deed in Fenn's office that she was finished turning around. The escarpment rose above them when they arrived on the afternoon of the second day. It was higher than she had let herself picture the granite face, catching the late light and holding it the way some stone holds light, not reflecting, not absorbing, simply keeping it as though the rock had patience enough for everything. The cave mouth sat low at the base, maybe 4 feet at the entrance, and the cold that came from it carried the smell of geological time, of a space that had been dark for longer than the town of Crestfall had existed. She stood at the entrance with the lantern lit. Ellis stood beside her. Neither spoke. She thought strange how an ending and a beginning can wear the same face when you are standing at the threshold of either one. The cliff did not welcome her. The stone had no opinion about divorce, no opinion about what a woman could or couldn't do with a 7-year-old son and 18 days in a grandmother's notebook. It was simply there, magnificently, unconditionally there. And that was its own kind of invitation. She bent her head and stepped inside. The ceiling lifted as she walked deeper. After 10 feet, she could stand fully upright. After 20, the lantern light reached the back wall. She stopped. She raised the lantern. She stepped closer. The wall was smooth in places, rough in others, and there at chest height, carved into the basalt with something narrow and determined, DC 1851. She put the lantern down on the cave floor. She placed her palm against the stone. Her middle finger fit the groove of the C exactly. She stood without breathing for several seconds and then several more. Dorothea Calt had stood in this exact darkness, pressed her hand to this exact face, and then had lived. She had gone back down. She had raised her daughter. She had buried a husband who never knew where she had hidden. She had taught a granddaughter to count when her chest got tight, and she had pressed flowers into letters. And she had died at 61, leaving behind a cedar box and a notebook and the coordinates to the one place she had found in the worst season of her life that held when everything else was giving way. Rowena pressed her forehead to the wall beside her grandmother's initials. She closed her eyes. She did not pray. She did not make any sound. She only stood there with her palm on the stone and felt something move through her that was older than grief and quieter than relief, the feeling of a relay baton passing between two hands across 32 years. Behind her from the cave mouth, Ellis's voice came small and careful. "Mama, is it okay in there?" She opened her eyes. She picked up the lantern. She turned around. He was standing in the entrance, his bundle still under his arm, the late October light behind him, making him look like he'd been framed in hammered copper. Her son, 7 years old. She thought, everything I build from here, I build for him. "Yes, baby." Her voice was level and she meant it to be, and it was. "It's okay in here." She walked toward him, toward the entrance, toward the cart, with its load of everything she still owned, toward the work that was waiting for her in whatever light remained before dark. The floor came first. Dorothea had written it plainly in the notebook, underlining the instruction as though she had learned through failure before arriving at certainty. Floor first. Always floor first, wind comes under. Not over a packed clay surface, over flat stone holds. Heat better than wood and will not rot. Rowena read it twice by lantern light on the second morning, then walked the creek bed for 2 hours selecting stones by feel flat on at least one face heavy enough to stay light enough to carry. Ellis worked beside her without being asked, his selection process methodical in the way that surprised her. Still the way he would hold a stone, turn it, set it aside, or keep it with the same deliberate patience she associated with men twice his age. By midday, they had enough for 6 square feet. By the end of the third day, the floor of the cave's main chamber was laid. She packed the clay between stones with her bare fingers, working it into the joints until her hands were the color of the creek bank. The cracking started on day 2. By day 4, her fingertips were bleeding at the knuckles, small splits in the skin that the cold opened wider each morning. She wrapped them in strips of cotton at night. By the 7th day, a new layer of skin had grown over the old damage, thicker, less sensitive, belonging to a woman who worked with stone, not the woman who had planted a kitchen garden in rented soil. She looked at her hands one evening in the lantern light and did not recognize them as the hands she had started with. She decided that was the correct response to what she was becoming. Once the deadline of 18 days had passed, with her already inside the cave, the pressure of it dissolved the way storm clouds dissolve after rain has fallen. The thing it was threatening had already happened, and the world had not ended. What remained was simply the work day by day, without a calendar holding a knife to her throat. She breathed easier for that. She worked harder for that. The door took 9 days. She had never made a door. She read Dorothea's instruction 3 times. Don't fight the cave. The cave is older than your tools. Make the door fit the cave. Not the cave fit the door. then read it a fourth time because the instruction was not about carpentry. She found cottonwood along the creek, dead wood dry, the grain running straight enough to work. The hatchet was her father's. The blade still good from years of proper use on the Elko Ranch, where she had learned that the difference between a tool that lasts and one that fails is whether the person holding it respects what it was made for. She roughed the frame first, then carried it to the cave mouth and held it against the opening. The rock pushed in on the left side at about shoulder height. She marked it with charcoal, trimmed, held it again. The rock curved at the bottom right. Marked, trimmed again. By the fifth day of door work, Ellis had named the process without being told what it was he called it. Listening to the rock, which was as accurate a description as any she could have offered him. On the morning of the ninth day, she set the frame in the opening, and it held wedged into the irregular shape of the cave mouth. Not perfect, not plumb by any standard, a carpenter in Crestfall would recognize, but solid. She pushed it with both palms. It did not move. Ellis, watching from the sleeping loft he had helped lash into place against the back wall 3 days prior, approved the result with a single nod of the kind she had come to associate with his most considered judgments. The brace latch went on that afternoon, and it was when she drove the first screw into the iron bracket that she understood what Orrin Mackey had done. The 3 hinges he had hidden in the flour sack were forged, not cast hand-shaped, each one slightly individual, the work of a man who had spent time at a forge, making something that would outlast the reason it was made. She had found them 2 days after arriving when she emptied the sack into the storage jars. The discovery stopped her entirely. She sat down on the cave floor with the hinges in her lap and remained there while something that had been held at pressure inside her chest finally released, not in tears, but in a long, shaking stillness, the kind of stillness that follows when a body realizes it is not in fact as alone as it had been carrying itself. 10 minutes. Then she set the hinges on the shelf in order of size and went back to work. There were still good men in the world. She had almost let herself forget that. The loft mattered because of what came 12 days after she finished it. Ellis started coughing on a Tuesday afternoon, small and dry, the kind that sounds like a throat clearing itself. By Tuesday night, it had changed registers, settling deeper, and when she put her hand on his forehead, the heat was immediate, unmistakable. She went for the thermometer she had packed from the drawer of the rented house, a small mercury instrument in a leather case. The glass read 105 degrees. She looked at it. She looked at her son on the sleeping pallet, his eyes glassy, his small chest moving faster than it should. She panicked for 40 seconds. She counted them later, reviewing what those 40 seconds had contained. The pacing, the hands on her face, the thought that she had made a catastrophic error, that she had dragged her son into the wilderness to save herself from humiliation, and had only traded one danger for a worse one. 40 seconds of that. Then she stopped in the middle of the cave floor. She breathed. She walked to the back wall. She placed her palm flat on the basalt beside the carved initials, and she said out loud into the cold and the dark, "Lord, I'm not asking for ease. I'm asking for time." She opened her eyes. She went to the notebook. Yerba Santa. The entry was 3 pages in from the back, written in the smaller hand Dorothea used when she was recording something she considered essential. Resinous leaves, deep green, a sticky quality to the surface. Found on rocky south-facing slopes. For fever and congestion of the lungs, steep 1 full handful of dried leaf in 2 cups of boiling water. For 20 minutes, strain through cloth. Give 3 swallows every 2 hours. Do not stop until the fever breaks. In the margin below, in even smaller writing, cool the body too. Medicine works from inside, but the fever leaves through the skin. Cool water cloths on the wrists and neck, and the soles of the feet rotate every 15 minutes alongside the tea. The two together do what neither does alone. She had collected yerba Santa leaves in October, 6 weeks prior, following Dorothea's description of where it grew. The leaves were in a clay jar on the 3rd shelf. She took it down. Her hands were steady, she made them be. She measured a full handful, pressed the leaves into the bottom of the cast iron pot, poured boiling water from the smaller pot she kept on the hearthstone. She set the kitchen clock she had packed on the shelf beside the fire and watched the minute hand. 20 minutes. They were the longest 20 minutes she had experienced since the morning she sat outside the courthouse, waiting for the judge to make the divorce final. While the tea steeped, she went to the creek with a bowl. The water was near freezing. She tore strips from a cotton shirt that had belonged to Webb, which she had kept for cleaning rags, which now served a better purpose than it ever had when he wore it. She came back. She knelt beside Ellis. She wrapped a cool strip around his left wrist, another around his right, folded one across the back of his neck, laid one flat across the soles of his feet. The first strip went warm within a minute. She replaced it, then the next. She rotated them with the mechanical focus of a woman who has decided that the only thing that exists in the world right now is this rotation, this temperature, this child. When the tea was ready, she strained it through the cleanest cloth she had. She lifted Ellis's head. His eyes were half open, not tracking. She tipped 3 swallows into his mouth, slowly watching his throat move. He swallowed. She lowered his head, watched his chest. The clock measured 2 hours. She gave 3 more swallows. Replaced the cloths. 2 more hours. 3 swallows. The fire needed feeding at the 3rd rotation, and she crossed the cave, added 2 pieces of hardwood, was back at his side in 45 seconds. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She gave him 3 swallows of bitter tea every 2 hours through the night, and the next day, and into the second night, and she rotated cool cloths every 15 minutes, and she watched her son's chest rise and fall and rise. At 3 in the morning of the second night, the skin beneath her hand changed. The change was slow, then sudden, a temperature drop, like a door swinging open in a warm room. The sweat came after soaking through his shirt, and she changed him into dry clothes without fully waking him. She laid him back on the pallet, covered him, sat beside him on the cave floor with her back against the stone. She was empty in the particular way a vessel becomes empty when it has held one thing at full capacity for too long. Nothing left for secondary functions. Nothing left for anything except sitting and watching his chest move. Ellis opened his eyes at 4. His voice was thin but present. "Did great-grandma teach you how to make the medicine?" She could not speak. She nodded. He smiled, small, authentic, the smile of a child who has come back from somewhere and is glad to find the same room waiting. "She's a good teacher, Mama." He slept again. Rowena sat beside him until dawn came gray through the cave mouth, and then she stood up, rebuilt the fire, and started the day. She was mending a wool sock by the fire that afternoon when she registered the presence at the cave entrance through the changed quality of the light. A shadow at the mouth. She was on her feet before she was fully present to the room. The man at the entrance wore a buckskin coat worn to the texture of old bark. He carried a long rifle with the ease of a man who had carried one since before his arms were long enough to hold it comfortably. A mule stood behind him, loaded but not heavily. He had stopped at a considered distance, not close enough to be presumptuous, not far enough to seem tentative. His face was creased by weather in the way that faces are creased when they have spent decades in direct negotiation with the sun and wind of the Nevada high country. He did not call out. He simply stood, taking in the woodpile, the fitted door propped open to catch the afternoon air, the shelf visible through the opening with its ranked jars. Something moved through his expression that was not surprise. It was recognition. Rowena did not speak first. She had learned in the months since Webb that silence was a form of information collection, and that the person who filled it first was usually the person with more need of the other's assessment. He spoke eventually to the air between them, rather than directly to her. "Folks in Crestfall say Silas Cout left you nothing but a hole in the ground. We have what we need." She kept her voice flat, not unfriendly, factual. He looked at the entrance again, the fitted frame the way the door had been scribed to the irregular stone. Something recalibrated in his face. A prediction revised. Harlan Sues. Not an introduction, a statement of something already established, the way men who spend long stretches alone represent themselves to the human world. He stepped toward the cave entrance, and she did not stop him. He walked past her to the back wall. He stood before the carved letters with his hat in his hand and his back to her for a long time. When he turned, his face had changed entirely. It was the face of a man looking at something he had carried for 32 years without knowing he was carrying it. "Dorothea Cout." Not a question. Rowena crossed her arms. "My grandmother." He nodded once slow. "I knew her." The air in the cave shifted. Ellis appeared at the edge of the firelight, quiet as always, watching. Harlan Sues had been 12 years old in the winter of 1851. His father had died on the trail west, somewhere in Utah Territory, fever taking him in 4 days. His mother had set out toward her sister's homestead in Oregon with the boy and a mule and the wrong kind of confidence about mountain weather. The snow came early in the passes, the way early snow comes without warning and without apology. His mother went out one afternoon to look for the trail's continuation and did not return. He crawled into this cave to wait, and then to stop waiting. He had been there 3 days, he thought. Though time had become imprecise by then. Dorothea Calt had been passing through, moving along the north face of the escarpment, as she apparently did in those years, for reasons the notebook did not fully state. She found him. She fed him. He remembered the smell of cornbread on a hearthstone, he said, and a woman's voice telling him he was going to live in the tone of someone making a factual correction rather than offering comfort. She kept him for 2 weeks. She walked him down to the South Trail and put him on a wagon heading east toward the settlements. His eyes were wet when he finished. She had not expected that from a man with a face like weathered granite. She found she had nothing useful to say to it, so she said nothing, which was the right response. Before she had put him on the wagon, Dorothea had said something. Harlan had carried it for 32 years, repeated it to himself in the particular way that important things become interior monologue, the sentences worn smooth by repetition. He said it now, his voice quiet and certain. She told me some things are given as wounds. Some things are received as foundations. The difference is in the receiver. The cave was quiet. Rowena felt the tears before she decided to let them, which meant she hadn't decided they had arrived on their own, the way things arrive when the body recognizes something the mind is still reaching toward. Ellis, from his position near the fire, said in his matter-of-fact way, "Mama writes that down sometimes." Harlan looked at the boy. He nodded once. "I expect she does." He left a smoked ham on the flat stone outside the cave entrance, the kind of man who understood that charity had to be disguised as transaction to be received by someone who still had their pride intact. He said he'd trade it for potatoes when she had them in spring. At the edge of the aspen line, he stopped, turned back. "Miss Calt." She waited. "Your grandmother," she had a way of standing when she was thinking. One hand on her hip, her head tipped sideways like she was listening to something no one else could hear. A pause long enough to mean something. "I see it in you." He turned. The mule followed without being led. She stood in the cave entrance a long time after the aspens closed behind him. Ellis leaned against her side. "He cried," he observed. "Old men don't usually cry." She put her arm around his shoulders. "No, baby, they don't." A pause. "It was about great-grandma." "Yes." "She kept him alive." "Yes." "And she's keeping us alive, too." She bent and pressed her lips to the top of his head. His hair smelled of wood smoke. "Yes, sweetheart, she is." 5 days after Harlan's visit, Rowena was outside gathering the last of the buffalo berry stalks when she heard hooves on the trail. She straightened. She did not move from where she was standing. The rider appeared around the trail's bend, Aldous Fenn, on his way to the new storage barn he was overseeing at the north end of the valley, the one with the soaring roofline, the milled lumber freighted in at considerable expense. He slowed as he passed the cave. His eyes moved across the woodpile, the smoke rising from the rock face, the cleared garden terrace, the fitted door, the shelves visible through the cave mouth. She watched his expression build its assessment, the slight superior arrangement of a man whose prediction is being cataloged as confirmed, even though the evidence in front of him told a different story entirely. He shook his head by a fraction. He touched his heels to the horse. He rode on without speaking to her, without acknowledging Ellis, as though the cost of words exceeded what the exchange was worth. Ellis watched him disappear around the trail's curve. "He didn't say hello." Rowena set down the stalk she was holding. "No, that's rude." She knelt to his level. "Some people, when they see someone they don't approve of, decide that person isn't worth their words. They think the silence is a punishment." Ellis considered this with his characteristic deliberateness. "Is it only if you wanted his words?" He turned the idea over. "I don't want his words." She met his eyes. "Neither do I." He nodded once and went back inside. She stood up, looked at the empty trail, thought with complete calm, he is building something to be seen. We are building something to last. Then came the warning that changed the shape of everything. Harlan came down from the eastern rock face on a Thursday morning, and she knew from his face before he spoke that he had not come for conversation. He did not dismount. He looked at the northern sky, the color of which she had been watching for 3 days, without the correct name for what she was seeing. A flat, metallic sheen like the side of a blade held at an angle to a light source you couldn't locate. Dorothea had named it in the October 1851 entries, the sky taking a breath. Rowena pulled her coat closer when she understood she was watching the same sky her grandmother had watched from this same ground. Harlan named what was coming by describing what he had read along the ridgelines 3 days out. A pressure system the biggest he had tracked in this valley since 1856. A thing that would not behave like ordinary winter weather. Ordinary storms fell and moved on. This kind stalled. How long? She kept her eyes on his face. A week, could be longer. The pressure signatures on a system this size, they don't respond like the smaller ones. He looked down at her. You've done well. Now do more. Double the wood. Pack the door seams with moss or cloth. When it hits, do not open that door until you've had 2 full days of silence after the wind completely stops. She asked why 2 full days. Snow at this scale settles and compresses. A door opened too soon into a packed drift does 2 things. Lets your heat out. Sometimes the drift weight holds the door shut when you try to close it again. You'd be giving up a sealed cave for an open one. Don't make that trade. He looked at Ellis, who had come to stand in the cave entrance with his arms at his sides. Boy. Ellis straightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, sir. Your mother knows what she's doing. You pay attention to her the way you're paying attention. Right now you'll be fine. Ellis nodded without speaking. Harlan turned the mule and rode back the way he had come. That evening, Rowena stood at the cave entrance with Ellis beside her and looked at the northern sky, doing what Dorothea had named for it. She pulled her coat closed. She thought about Dorothea standing at this same entrance in October 1851, reading the same sky, and she understood that her grandmother had not merely left instructions for survival in a cave. She had left instructions for reading the world correctly, the sky, the water, the wind, the hands of men, the words beneath the words people spoke. The notebook was a manual for seeing. Rowena had been reading it all her life without knowing that was what it was. Mama! Ellis's voice was the voice he used when he was filing information. What can I do? She knelt beside him in the cold. She took his shoulders in her hands. She told him exactly. He could help count the stores each morning. He could help pack moss into the door seams. He could carry the smaller split wood. He could learn the rotation system for the fire, small pieces added on a schedule, never letting it drop below the level she would show him. He could do everything she asked without asking why until there was time for why. Can you do that? He looked at her with the eyes of someone who has decided to be useful rather than frightened. Yes, Mama. She pulled him briefly close. Then they went inside to begin. The storm came on the 4th night, not gradually. All at once the pressure drop felt in the ears first, then the fire leaning sideways for one strange second before it straightened. Then the sound low and distant building through registers that did not have names. Not wind exactly. Something older than wind, a frequency felt in the chest before the ears confirmed it. The door shuddered. The jars on the shelves vibrated faintly enough that she had to press her palm to one to verify the sensation was real. Ellis climbed down from the sleeping loft, crossed the cave, sat beside her on the bench near the fire without a word. She put her arm around him. He leaned into her side. Outside, the storm committed itself fully to its business, and inside the cave, the fire held. They had been learning each other in new ways during those 7 days. She had always known Ellis was watchful, but the storm revealed the depth of it. He kept a mental inventory of the firewood without being asked, informing her each morning of the count with the precision of a quartermaster. He monitored the food stores by touch in the dark, locating each jar by its position on the shelf, reporting changes in weight. On the 4th day, he caulked a gap in the door's lower seam using a strip of wool from his own spare shirt without telling her until it was done. He was 7 years old. She had thought she was teaching him survival. He had been teaching himself using her as the model. On the 5th day, the smoke stopped going up. She noticed the wrongness before she had language for it, a tightness in her chest that was not emotion but atmosphere, the room changing its quality. She looked up. A faint haze had begun at the ceiling, settling lower with the patience of something that did not need to hurry. Ellis coughed once. Small. Involuntary. The sound of it went through her like a wire pulled taut. She understood immediately. The fissure running up through the rock, the natural chimney Dorothea had mapped in 1851, had iced over at its upper exit. Days of drifting snow on the cliff face had packed over the opening. The channel still existed, the smoke had nowhere to go. Two choices, neither good. Put out the fire, let the temperature fall to what a granite cave holds in December without a heat source. Or climb 22 feet up through a crack in the rock in the dark in a blizzard to break the ice from the inside. She set down what she was holding. She looked at the fire. She looked at her son. She crossed to the back wall and placed her palm flat on the basalt beside DC 1851 and spoke quietly into the stone. I cannot do this. 3 full breaths. Yes, I can. Because there is no one else. Because he is 7 years old. Because the only person in this cave who can climb that fissure is the woman standing in front of it. So she will. She explained it to Ellis the way she explained weather factual sequenced without apology for the information. She watched him receive it. His face did not collapse. She tied 40 feet of rope around her waist, fixed the other end to the iron hook she had driven into the hearthstone. The rope would not stop a fall. It would tell Ellis where she was if she went still. She put on her thickest coat. She drew on Dorothea's gloves, brown leather found in the coat pocket in week 2, worn smooth a size large on her hands, and had the brief, clear thought, I am going to break open the roof of this cave with my grandmother's hands. Ellis! He was standing near the fire holding the notebook against his chest with both arms. If I don't come back down, he shook his head. Quiet, certain you're coming back down. She held his eyes. Say it. He held hers. You're coming back down. She picked up the hardwood rod she had cut that morning. She stood at the base of the fissure. She wedged her boot into the first opening, found a handhold with her right, pressed her back against one face of the crack, her knees against the other, and began. It was not climbing the way men climb mountains. It was the body becoming its own architecture, using itself as a lever and a brace and a wedge trading pressure between surfaces in a slow negotiation that required complete attention to the rock's geometry. Her arms knew sustained work the ranch outside Elko had seen to that, years of fence posts and hay bales, and a father who didn't distinguish between daughters and sons when there was work requiring doing. She drew on that memory now, muscle calling to muscle across the years. 6 feet, 8. The fissure narrowed at 12. She had to empty her lungs to compress through it. She pushed the air out, slid through. 15. Her arms had begun to shake with the sustained isometric demand. She did not stop because stopping at 15 feet in the dark, with her son below, watching a rope was not something she could let herself translate into a real possibility. 18 feet, 19, 20. The fissure opened into the dome pocket above. A hole the size of her palm sealed solid, not snow anymore, but compressed ice, the kind that forms when wind packs a surface below freezing, long enough to bind it into something that had forgotten it was ever anything softer. She braced her back and shoulders against the dome. She drove the rod up into the ice. The impact traveled back through her arms. A chip fell past her face. She drove again. Again. Switched hands when the right arm had nothing left used, the left switched back. A piece the size of a fist broke loose. Then a sound, clean, small, a single pop, and a needle of cold air struck her face, fresh, clean, so cold it hurt. She drove the rod wider, broke more, widened the hole until cold air was pouring down in a column that burned her throat when she breathed it in. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever inhaled. She rested her forehead on the rock. She breathed for 30 seconds. She began to come down. Going down was the settling of accounts for everything spent on the way up. She lowered herself by feel boot point first hand, searching each lower hold before committing weight. At 15 feet, her left foot lost purchase. The drop was 6 inches before her right elbow found a ledge and stopped it. Her left shoulder wrenched. She heard the sound of it inside her own body before she felt the pain. A small, deep pop, and then the pain arrived. She made a sound she had not planned. From below, Ellis. Mama. She steadied her breath. I'm all right, baby. Slipped. Coming down. She held the ledge with her right arm, found a new foot placement, continued. Her boots touched the cave floor. Her legs decided they were finished. She sat down hard. Ellis crossed the cave at a run and hit her with enough force that she went backward onto her elbows. He locked his arms around her neck. He was crying not the restrained leaking she had seen from him before, but real crying, the kind that comes when a child has held something too tightly for too long, and the thing they were holding is suddenly safely returned. You came back. She held the back of his head in one hand. I came back. You said you would. She rocked him. The smoke was rising again, moving toward the ceiling in the slow, clean column that meant the channel above was open. I came back, baby. I came back. She did not remember deciding to sleep. She woke an hour later, still on the cave floor, Ellis warm against her side. The fire was burning slightly higher than she had left it. He had fed it while she slept using the smaller split hardwood in exactly the order she had taught him. She put her hand over her eyes. She lay still for another minute, listening to the storm work itself against the mountain outside, and thought with a clarity she had not felt in weeks, I am not alone. I have never been alone. I have my grandmother. I have my son. I have these hands. That is not a small inheritance. That is, in fact, everything required. On the seventh day, the storm stopped. Not gradually, completely all at once, as though someone on the other side of the mountain had made a decision. One moment, the cave walls were conducting the vibration of it through Rowena's palms. The next moment, they were not. The quiet that followed was so absolute she pressed her fingers to her ear to confirm she had not gone deaf in the night. Ellis sat up on the sleeping loft. He looked down at her. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Is it over? She thought of Harlan, of 2 full days of silence, not one. We wait, baby. Ellis looked at the cave mouth, looked back at her. He nodded. He did not ask how long. He had learned. They spent the waiting days in routine. She taught him the next sequence of reading longer words, compound sentences, the way meaning accumulates across a paragraph, rather than arriving all at once. He practiced on the pages of the notebook, following lines with his fingers, sounding harder words aloud. She cooked from the hearth. She mended what needed mending. She inspected every seam of the cave structure she had built and found it sound: the floor, the door, the firebox, the sleeping loft, all of it holding exactly as she had designed it, which was to say, exactly as Dorothea had designed it 32 years before her. On the afternoon of the second waiting day, she found Ellis at the back wall. She had learned to recognize when he had gone there with purpose, a particular quality of stillness, the lantern held in both hands rather than one. She stopped at the edge of the firelight. She did not interrupt. He was speaking to the carved initials in the low, steady voice he used when he had decided something mattered enough for full attention. She heard fragments, the fever, the tea, the cloths rotated every 15 minutes in the cold. She heard him say she hadn't slept not 1 minute, that he had watched her not sleeping, and she hadn't said so. He demonstrated something with his free hand, his palm flat against his sternum. That means scared, he told the stone. But she doesn't say. A pause, the pause of someone listening for an answer. Then in his most serious register, thank you for teaching her great-grandma. She's a good student. He set the lantern down. He turned to come back toward the fire. He saw her standing in the shadow. He did not appear surprised. He crossed to her, took her hand, led her back toward the warmth without offering explanation. She did not ask for one. Some things in a child's interior life belong only to that child, and the mother's job is to recognize the boundary and hold it. On the morning of the third day of silence, she picked up the hatchet. She worked the ice from the door's seal, methodically starting at the top corner, the way Harlan had specified, top corner first, let the crack run down rather than pushing inward. Snow came in when she opened the door, not powder, but the consolidated material of a drift that had spent 7 days compressing under its own weight. It fell onto the cave floor with a heaviness that made Ellis's eyebrows rise, then settle into what she recognized as determination. She dug at an upward angle, following the path of least resistance. She traded with Ellis every 3 minutes, consistent intervals, neither of them going past their capacity, the task broken into a series of manageable portions rather than confronted as a whole. He moved snow from the tunnel mouth to the cold storage at the back, his arms full to his chin, each trip his boots finding the cave floor with the certainty of someone who knows a place by heart. Trip after trip. Neither spoke much. The work was the conversation. The fourth hour was when the shovel broke through. The blade found an absence where resistance had been. A hole appeared above her, roughly the circumference of her fist, and through it fell a shaft of light so white that she had to turn her face away. Behind her, Ellis made a sound she would remember for the rest of her life, not a word. Not a cry, not a laugh, but the sound a human body makes when it receives something it has been without long enough to genuinely understand what the absence cost. She widened the hole until it was large enough for a body to pass through, then climbed out first because the unknown environment above required assessment before she brought her son into it. The landscape had been remade entirely. Drifts had formed in shapes that suggested arrested motion waves caught at the moment of breaking frozen mid-collapse. The surface was hard enough to walk on. The sky above was a shade of blue she had never seen before and suspected could only be produced by a major weather system that had scoured the atmosphere of everything except itself, a blue of extraordinary clarity, almost aggressive in its purity. She turned to look at where the cave should have been. The cliff face behind her was buried to more than halfway up a smooth, consolidated bank running from the ground to the rock unbroken. She was standing on the roof of her home. The thought arrived with a vertigo that was not entirely unpleasant. She helped Ellis up through the hole. He emerged into the bright cold and stopped beside her. His face performed the focused data gathering of a child encountering something genuinely unprecedented, cataloging rather than reacting. He bent down. From the surface of the drift, he picked up a small gray stone oval, smooth, the kind that creek water produces over years of patient friction. He placed it in her palm without looking at her face. She felt the weight of two stones in her coat pocket, now the one from October, the one from today. A season bookended between them. She closed her fingers around both. The walk to Crestfall took 3 hours to cover 2 miles. The trail had been erased. They navigated by the angle of the light, by the line of the valley's walls, by occasional fence posts emerging from the drift at unfamiliar heights. The town materialized ahead as a collection of smoke sources and exposed roof lines, some complete, some interrupted. She stopped at the rise above the settlement. 7 houses with sound roof lines, 4 with structural damage, 3 that had not held at all. The church was standing, but its tower was not. The bell tower of First Methodist, the one Strand had fundraised across 3 counties, had snapped at the base and lay across the churchyard at a diagonal like timber felled without ceremony. The brass bell had rolled and come to rest against the far fence. Rowena looked at it for a long moment. Stone makes no promises, she thought, but stone breaks none either. Towers are a different matter. She walked into town. The first person they met was Orrin Mackey at the edge of what had been the livery stable, his shovel upright beside him. His face, when he saw them coming across the packed snow, went through something she recognized because she had felt it herself, the rapid reorganization of a person who has been carrying one version of events and is now being handed a different one. He had not expected them. He went very still. When she was close enough, he stepped forward. The embrace was brief, firm, not the gesture of a man with romantic intentions, but of one who had spent several days reckoning with loss and had just been told one name didn't belong on the list. He stepped back. He looked at Ellis. "You took care of your mother." Ellis met the assessment evenly. "She took care of me." Orrin looked between them. "I expect you both took care of each other." Ellis considered whether this was accurate. "Yes, sir." Orrin nodded, then his expression changed. 12 people. She closed her eyes. One moment was all she required. Orrin gave her one. Then, "What can I do?" Something in his face moved that was not quite a smile but occupied the same location. "You always ask that first." He told her about the Whitfield place, the east wall collapse, the boy still unaccounted for. She nodded. She handed him the cloth bundle she had been carrying, dense pemmican, the concentrated kind made for extended cold, and told him to distribute it where it was needed. He took it, and she noticed the care with which he did it, and did not say anything about the care. She found Fenn in the afternoon. He was sitting on a wooden chair someone had placed in front of the wreckage of what had been his house. The east wing had come down. His coat was borrowed 2 sizes broad across the shoulders, the sleeves covering his hands. His boots were ruined, the expensive leather cracked beyond recovery. His hands rested on his knees. The hands that had pushed the deed across the desk with 2 fingers were now simply resting without purpose or performance, like tools left out after a job that turned out to be larger than expected. He saw her coming across the snow, Ellis beside her. She watched him process the information of them, their steadiness, the color in Ellis's face, the absence of the diminishment he had evidently expected this winter to produce. She watched the calculation run behind his eyes. His wife had not survived the storm. The total being calculated contradicted the premises he had been working from for 2 years. He tried to speak. What came out was not language, a compressed, dry sound. He put his head down. She stood before him and said nothing, because she had brought no words for him today and had no surplus from which to offer them. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, the borrowed coat, the ruined boots, the man whose scaffolding had been removed to reveal whatever was actually underneath. Then she turned to Ellis. "Come on, baby." They walked. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, she was splitting the last of the cottonwood scrap outside the cave when she heard boots on the trail. Single footfalls, deliberate, post-holing through the crust. She stood with the hatchet in her hand. Aldous Fenn came around the trail's bend on foot. Alone. He was wearing work clothes she had never seen on him. Heavy canvas trousers, a coat that was plainly not his primary coat, something kept in reserve for different occasions than the ones he had been in the habit of attending. He had walked 3 miles through broken snow to get here. She could see it in how he was breathing. He stopped at a respectful distance. He looked at the cave, the door, the stacked wood, the cleared ground, the evidence of 6 weeks of work that had preserved 2 lives through the worst storm the valley had seen in 30 years. He looked at all of it. Then he looked at her. "I owe you something I don't have the right words for." His voice was different from the office voice, flatter, less, manage the resources required to maintain the other version currently allocated elsewhere. "But I can start with my name on a piece of paper." She held the hatchet at her side. She looked at him for a long moment, taking the measure of what it had cost him to walk 3 miles through knee-deep snow without being asked, without anyone requiring it, to stand in front of a woman he had dismissed with 2 fingers and say a thing like that without a prepared speech. It was not nothing. It was the hardest available version of what he could have done. She nodded once. He understood she was not inviting him in. He turned. He walked back down the trail, and she watched him go until the trail curved and took him from view. Harlan Sues came down from the eastern face a week after the storm. He crossed the snow crust at his usual pace, the mule behind him, and stopped when he reached the cave entrance. He looked at the tunnel she had cut through the drift. He looked at the cave. He looked at her, then at Ellis. He nodded once, the complete evaluation and conclusion of a man who does not require more words than the situation earns. "You held." She held his gaze. "We held." He stayed longer than his previous visits. He sat on the flat stone outside the entrance and drank coffee she made on the hearthstone, and said things about the storm's behavior at the high elevations that she stored as practical knowledge for the following winter. Before he left, he set down his coffee cup and looked at the cave mouth. "There's something I never told you about the day your grandmother walked me down to the wagon." She waited. "She gave me a piece of dried apple from her own stores before she put me on that wagon. She didn't have many," she said. "Pass it on when the time comes." He reached into his coat. He produced a small cloth pouch tied at the neck. 32 years, Miss Calt. I've kept the agreement. Each time I've passed it on, I've replaced it with another, kept the chain unbroken." He held the pouch out. She took it. Inside, through the cloth, she could feel the slight firmness of a single dried apple slice. He stood. He touched the brim of his hat. "Yours now. Pass it on when the time comes." He turned. The mule fell in behind him without being signaled. She stood at the cave entrance until the aspens closed over his path. Ellis was beside her. He looked at the pouch in her hands, then up at her face. "What's that for?" She turned the pouch in her palms, feeling the slight weight of the thing inside the 32-year chain of intention it represented. "It's a promise, baby, between people across time. Your great-grandma made it. Mr. Sues kept it. Now it's mine to keep." She looked at him. "One day it'll be yours to carry." He received this with the gravity it merited. He nodded. He did not ask when. He already understood that some things were passed on when the time announced itself, not before. 3 weeks after the storm, Orrin Mackey came up the path with a folded paper in his hand. He brought seed beans, a jar of honey, a pair of winter boots from a family in town whose boy had outgrown them. He stood in the cave entrance and held out the paper. She unfolded it. A petition addressed to the County Land Office of Elko County requesting formal recognition of her claim to the 19 acres designated Couts Blunder, requesting additionally a 10-year tax abatement in recognition of the land's character and the documented improvements made upon it. 27 signatures, some in careful block letters, some in practiced hands. At the bottom of the page, in small, precise letters written with heavier pressure than the rest, as though the pen had been pressed down with conscious effort, Aldous Fenn. She looked at that signature for a long time. Ellis came to read over her shoulder. He had been working through the notebook for 3 weeks and could manage most of what was put in front of him now. His finger found the bottom of the page. That's the lawyer. Yes. He signed it. Yes. He thought about this with his customary thoroughness. Does it count if he did it slow? She looked at her son. It counts more, because it cost him more. Ellis weighed this. He accepted it. Can I keep it with my stones? She handed it to him. He was the right keeper. He would understand its weight more fully as time passed. The way stones become more fully themselves the longer you carry them. Keep it. When you're older, you'll understand what it cost the man who signed it last, because you'll have been asked to do something difficult yourself, and you'll know what it feels like to choose the harder way. He carried the petition to his bundle and placed it inside with care. She knew by now what the bundle contained: the 7 creek stones, the birch bark with the owl, the wooden horse his father had carved in the good year, a small charcoal drawing he had made on an afternoon in November when she had looked away for an hour. That evening she opened the notebook to the last blank page. The light from the hearth was steady, the cave warm at the temperature she had learned to maintain through 6 months of practice until it required no monitoring. Ellis was asleep on the loft. She could hear his breathing from where she sat, even in deep, the breathing of a child who has decided the night is safe. She wrote in her own hand the letters smaller than her grandmother's, but shaped by the same valley, the same stone. February 1884. Rowena Cout, granddaughter of Dorothea Cout. We survived the winter at the cave you marked. My son Ellis is 7 years old. He kept the fire the night I climbed the fissure. He gave me a stone in October and a stone in February, and they are the same stone made twice. I know now that you ran here too, in 1851, from a husband who could not be lived with. I did not know. My mother never said. Maybe she didn't know either. But you wrote it down and kept the notebook and left it where it could find me, as though you understood, across all the years between us, that the knowledge would be needed again. If you are reading this, some daughter or granddaughter of mine, I will not live to see remember this. We come from women who chose stone when we had nothing else. We chose what holds. The wound was real. The foundation is real too. They are not opposites. They are the same material received differently. Stone makes no promises, but stone breaks none either. Welcome home, child. She closed the notebook. She held it for a moment, then set it on the shelf between the clay jar of yerba Santa leaves and the small cloth pouch with its dried apple slice. 3 objects forming a small altar to the knowledge that had kept them alive. Each one the gift of a woman or man who had understood that survival is not a solitary achievement, but a chain each linked depending on the one before it, each one obligated to the ones that follow. The fire settled with a quiet report, the sound of hardwood giving its last heat to the room. Outside in the February dark, the cliff face rose above the cave, the way it had risen above every person who had ever stood at its base, indifferent to their circumstances, available, regardless of their merit, older than the troubles that drove people to it. The snow on its face had begun in the past 3 days to show the first fractional loosening of deep winter's grip. Not thaw, nothing so definitive yet, but a softening at the edges. Water beginning to remember what it is before it actually moves. On the back wall of the cave, 3 sets of marks occupied the same stone that had held them through the storm, through the fever, through the 32 years between one woman's flight and another's arrival at the same shelter. DC 1851, RCEC 1884. Below those in Ellis's careful charcoal, a small drawing, 3 figures standing with their hands joined, the one in the middle wearing something long that belonged to another century. He had never said who the figures were. He did not need to. The drawing recorded not what had happened, but what was permanently true. Three people standing together in a place built to hold their hands, joined across the decades that separated them, in a cave that had been waiting for exactly this purpose since before any of them were born. Rowena added one piece of hardwood to the fire. She sat down beside the hearth. She put her back against the stone. She closed her eyes. The cave held her the way it had held every woman who had come to it with nothing but need, and the willingness to work without condition, without requiring that she be anything other than what she was. A woman who had chosen stone, who had built something with her hands that the worst winter in 30 years had tested and not broken, who had kept her son alive, who had received a wound as a foundation and built on it. She stayed. The fire burned low. Outside in the long dark between winter and whatever came next, the snowpack shifted too small to hear too early to name toward spring.